Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I think let's just give it one more minute and then we'll start the webinar. Thank you. Good. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. It's wonderful to see such a great turnout. Allow me to introduce myself. So I am Tim Doberman. I'm the Director of Research at the International Growth Center, IGC. And with us, we have quite a number of members of the IGC team. But the purpose of today's webinar is to really take a few steps towards creating a greater research community on fragility and thinking about kind of the root causes of fragility, as well as how fragility impacts economic development over the long run. And a key part of that, which we're hoping to achieve through this webinar, is to bring in early career researchers, so PhD students, kind of postdocs, and others who have potential interests in doing work in this space. So I'll be chairing today's webinar, and just to run through the agenda briefly, um, we'll have a few opening kind of ideas, if you will, from Professors Michael Callan and Raul Sanchez de la Sierra to kind of frame why they think this is an exciting space to do research, so why we need more research on fragility and fragility issues around the world. But also rather selfishly, why it might be an attractive thing for you to do in terms of your academic returns as a researcher. So why we think there's kind of a gap in the academic discourse on these topics and why research in these spaces might be particularly impactful. So they will each talk for about 5 or 10 minutes, just laying out some of their own ideas and perspectives on the space. And then I'll hand over to the SFI team, so the State Fragility Initiative team at IGC, to describe a little bit more about themselves and the work that they've been doing over the past several years, as well as to go into more information and more detail on potential avenues for kind of scoping pilots and scoping grants. So we're quite keen to give small amounts of funding for early career researchers to go to the field and perhaps investigate the ability to potentially develop a larger pilot or project, or to just have resources available for things like data collection or research assistance support to kind of develop initial project ideas. So they will run through what we're potentially offering and the steps that if you are interested to get some of this funding, the steps that you need to undertake. So the final thing I'll say before handing over to Michael is that IGC overall, if you're not aware, is kind of a global research center that is based at LSE in Oxford, and we have country offices kind of across the world in Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East. But we've always been interested in doing research not just in these contexts. I think there's a lot of interesting research in the places where we have our country offices and have engagements with government. But on some of these really cross-cutting issues like fragility, we think there's a lot we can learn from contexts around the world. And so as part of our overall research strategy, we see questions that we'll be discussing today as quite central to our thinking of how we can support sustainable and inclusive growth across the board. So I will not say more. I think there's more interesting things to come. So perhaps let me now hand over to Michael to give kind of the first set of ideas and talking points on this as well.
Share the screen. All right, well, let me just echo Tim and say it's wonderful to see such a great turnout. Thank you all for joining. I'm linked to this initiative in two ways. First, I'm a co-editor at VoxDev. I'm also the lead academic for the State Fragility Initiative. And I am quite keen, and this will come out in my remarks, to try to encourage research on this topic. And so I'll sort of give you my perspective on why I think it's valuable. I'll talk a little bit of some of my own work on the topic, and then I'll hand over to Raul. So I thought I would just provide some broad motivation by providing a set of empirical facts about the world, and make some basic points about why I think this topic is as relevant as it's ever been and increasing in relevance all the time. So make 2 points to start. So if you look, for example, at the left panel, this is making the point that the world's less stable. Let me explain how it does so. I've basically gone through all the Freedom House reports. These are reports that Freedom House kind of develops every single year, categorizing the nature of institutions, basically counting up civil liberties and political freedoms, and just counted the number of sentences in a given report in a given year that are about political uprising or political change. And so if you see kind of moving from 2000 to 2020, it was around 20% of the such sentences were about sort of political unrest in 2000. Now it's about 35%. So this is just one empirical example of the fact that the world is less stable. You could look at protests, you could look at violent incidents, a whole broad range of data sets would corroborate this basic point, but there is just more stability in the world. You can think of sort of the coup belt in Africa over the last 4 years as sort of case in point. The figure on the right is a little bit different. So this is just taking this Freedom House score. Freedom House categorizes countries into one of 3 broad categories: not free, partly free, or entirely free. And so what I've taken is just the 5-year rolling average across all countries where there are reports on the right hand, in the right-hand panel. And so negative movements mean basically increases in freedom across the world, that countries are moving into more free Freedom House categories. Sorry. You can see, the end of the Cold War, the third wave of democratization, an increase in freedom globally throughout the 90s that persisted throughout the 2000s, that basically reversed around the time of the financial crisis, and now is sort of distinguishably becoming, evidence that the world is less free. This case gets debated a lot. Like, is this truly a global trend towards backsliding? I think now the data are pretty unequivocal that indeed sort of freedom is receding from the world. And I think that this carries implications for sort of thinking about the big questions of development and growth, because it's likely to happen in less stable contexts, it's likely to happen in less free contexts, and just something that we need to kind of keep in our minds as background as we're thinking about what's different and what's relevant. The next kind of most important point, I think, from the perspective of the Fragile States Initiative is that this really is going to be where sort of the challenges of meeting the Sustainable Development Goals are going to begin concentrating. So the figure I've put up here is a figure from the OECD States of Fragility report. They categorize countries into 2 broad groups, either sort of partly fragile. These would be places like Nigeria, Pakistan, where there are pockets of fragility, but sort of the core state is not immediately under threat. And then there's these extremely fragile contexts. These would be places like Afghanistan, Yemen, Sudan. And you can see already in 2022, just over 20% of the world's extreme poor, people who live under $2 a day, live in these countries. That's forecast to grow to about 30% by 2030. So that's just kind of a fact about the world, that if we want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, we're going to need to figure out how to do so in fragile states. But I think there's also a useful conceptual point in this report. Is like, what is fragility? What does it mean? Why do we need to think about things potentially a bit differently when we're thinking about a fragile state? They make this point that it's exposure to risk, where I think risk here means risk that everything could change, that the state might fundamentally collapse, or you might have kind of a complete transition in the nature of institutions, and sort of an insufficient ability to deal with those risks. Now, if I look at where research attention is happening, so a core objective of this webinar and what we're trying to do at the Fragile States Initiative is to cultivate research on fragile states. I've tried to quantify the extent of sort of academic research attention that's paid to fragile states in 2 ways. The first is just to look at the share of randomized controlled trials that are registered in the American Economic Association registry, which is meant to be a comprehensive registry of sort of all randomized evaluations of programs in the fields. And very few of them, about 0.6% of them, are in these 15 extremely fragile states. If I look at other low and middle income countries, it's about 30%. So there's just sort of a paucity of research that's not really aligned with where we think the challenges in the world are going to arise. Another metric, something that academic economists care quite a bit about, is whether or not there are articles being written in these top 5 economics journals that would mean they'll get attention across the economics discipline. It's only about 2% of articles published since the year 2000 that actually regard these extremely fragile states, and mostly that's Congo and Afghanistan. So I think there are kind of 3 implications for this audience. I think we really we don't have much evidence at all on what we can do to address vulnerability in these settings. I think last week's webinar was kind of a nice example of change in the opposite direction, where there was kind of a discussion about how to use evidence for humanitarian response, which is a big part of the issue here. I think we need to think more deeply about what are the pathways toward durable developments in these fragile states. And something I'll talk a bit more about here, and is sort of something I am thinking a lot about, is how should we conceptualize fragility? What is it that distinguishes it? What makes a state fragile or not? What are sort of the distinguishing characteristics? And this point about risk is one that continues to resonate with me, certainly based on my own experience working on a reform I'll discuss in a moment in Afghanistan. When everything could change, when you know that sort of the fundamental nature of institutions can change, it really does cause sort of different considerations than you would think about in other contexts, especially when you're working on sort of state-led economic growth and development programs. An important point is that this is also going to be where we should expect there to be some of the worst impacts of climate change. So the figure on the right is reproduced from one of our VoxDev lits, the VoxDev lit on climate adaptation. This is a point that gets made very often, but the people who are going to suffer the most from climate change are those in low-income countries. The figure is just telling you what a 1% or a 1 degree increase in Celsius average temperature should do to GDP, and it's going to have the largest negative effects in low-income countries and in fragile states. Meeting these challenges, of course, requires capable states, so it just makes the challenge worse. I'm involved in a large project to understand sort of how politicians think about climate adaptation in Nepal. Nepal is one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, and also just emerging from a civil war and a new transition to federal democracy. And one clear message that emerges from this program is that as of yet, this is not sort of the top priority for politicians or for constituents. Turning now to the question of kind of where should research go, and why is there sort of a value proposition for those of you who are thinking about applying for these grants and doing research on these questions. So I recently wrote a review article with Noam Yuchtman of Oxford and John Weigel of UC Berkeley. And we tried to go through sort of the top 13 economics journals, top 2 political science journals comprehensively, and count up since 2000 the number of articles that were about different questions. These are all linked to fragility. So we counted up how many are regarding institutions, the rules of the game, sort of the idea behind this year's Nobel Prize in economics, how many feature RCTs, and how many meet the 3 criteria I've listed here on the left. How many are RCTs that are focused on sort of institutions, so not any RCT in health or in education, but really focused on the nature of sort of political institutions themselves, and happening in a moment and place and time where the institutions might be changing, what is commonly called the critical juncture. And you can see that the trend is pretty clear, at least with regard to where the research is headed. Research on institutions is growing. RCTs are certainly growing. There wasn't very much of this type of research to start with in 2009, but it's definitely increasing over time. So I think that people are realizing that this type of work is important. And so I think it's starting to get attention. Now, for the last few minutes of my comments, I just want to provide an example of an experiment that I think fits well into this type of research. So this is my own recent paper on a large-scale policy experiment I ran in collaboration with the Afghan government. It required me to embed quite deeply in the policy process in Afghanistan from 2016, basically till the Taliban took over in 2021. And the idea here was that we would transition teacher salary payments from the status quo, which was either they were just handed out physically as cash for most teachers, because most teachers don't have access to banks. For the teachers who work in cities, they were getting paid through electronic funds transfer. The idea was to create a comprehensive biometric registry of teachers and then to pay them using mobile money instead. And so we did get this up and running. It did kind of prove to be successful over the course of this project. But one thing kind of kept jumping out to us, which is that there was quite a bit of heterogeneity in terms of whether or not people were willing to undertake this initiative in the first place. And that is, there's a bunch of teachers who had the choice of whether or not they wanted to register and enroll in this mobile money program. And you can see here on the right, I'm basically showing the darker red polygons. We divided these 3 provinces up into a bunch of zones that were basically of equal size in terms of the number of teachers who were there. And there's quite a bit of heterogeneity in terms of the share of teachers who were eventually enrolled in the program. At the same time, I was thinking a lot about this question about what is fragility, what defines fragility, and kept coming back to this idea. I think Raul actually originally gave me this characterization that it's a situation of deep uncertainty about future institutions, that they might fundamentally change and totally change. And reflecting on my experience working on this reform in Afghanistan, that was certainly ever present. The idea that we don't know where this is headed, we don't know what the state is going to look like in 2 or 3 years' time. When the Taliban did take over, they did completely jettison this program and get rid of it entirely, and then imposed a series of pretty heavy restrictions on kind of who's allowed to get educated, especially women. So all of these investments did ultimately prove, in some sense, to be kind of to disappear when the Taliban took over. And so we wanted to test this idea as kind of uncertainty about future institutions. Where it's extreme, is that a potential detriment to contemporary investments in state capabilities? And we think sort of identifying and paying your employees is one of the most basic and fundamental administrative capacities any state would need in order to operate and operate effectively. So we used this question that the US Army was fielding quarterly with 20 respondents across Afghanistan, where they just asked people, who do you think is going to win this war in a few years' time? Which to us was a nice sort of ability, it gave us a nice opportunity to capture, were people confident that the Taliban would win or that the existing national unity government would win? This is just showing kind of responses to these kind of people who thought it would likely be defeated, the share who thought it would maybe be defeated or not defeated. It fans out right at the establishment of the national unity government. So this was the first peaceful transition since the US invasion. And that's basically around when we're working on the question. The figure on the right is just showing the relationship between sort of the average level of people who thought that the government was going to win the war and the number of people who are enrolling in the program or signing up for the program. The strength of that relationship is depicted on the vertical axis. The extent of disagreement between respondents in an area or in a district about who is going to win the war is reported on the x-axis. And so what this is telling us is in places where there's not relatively little disagreement about who is going to win the war, that is where there was consensus, the sensitivity of whether or not people would enroll to average beliefs about whether the Afghan government was going to win was higher. And so if I want to put this in a nutshell, I would say you sort of need both confidence and relative consensus about what the state is going to be to try to build this type of state capability, which I think is sort of fundamental state capability. And so it really does kind of, at least to me, start to point toward this idea that fragility as being about basic uncertainty about institutions as being kind of an important part of the story, certainly not the whole story, but one that keeps grabbing my attention. So to conclude, kind of putting back on my VoxDev and Fragile States Initiative hats, let me kind of put a few takeaways and give a few resources. So I think, ending poverty or reaching the sustainable development goals more generally is going to require addressing these issues in fragile states. Progress, if anything, has stalled or is reversing in these places, and at the same time, fragility is spreading. There's really not much in the way of sort of rigorous policy-focused research that yields solution in fragile states. The third, more conceptual point, but I think that's important, is there is something very different about an extremely fragile state. One kind of key dimension of difference is that the institutions are very uncertain. And so, why do we need more research here? Why can't we just transport the lessons that are available from the rest of development economics and bring those ideas to fragile states? I think some of them we can, but any that are sort of predicated on the idea that you have a durable state are going to potentially give you different solutions in a fragile state. And so I do think there's something different here that requires its own sort of research focus in order for us to have sort of appropriate solutions for fragile states. I've just listed a bunch of resources. I'm sure these slides will be posted and circulated. There's some I've missed, so sorry if I did. For example, JPAL, Humanitarian Protection Initiative, should be here. But these are all of the current initiatives that are either focused on or are funding fragile states research, including us. So hope we can encourage you to apply.
Great. Thank you, Michael. So I think a lot of really interesting points to start off with. And I think, yeah, and maybe just another reflection while Raul is kind of getting ready from his side. I think a lot of what we think is important here is to try to find ways in which we can support research in what are kind of inherently very difficult topics or contexts. And so I think that's why we're kind of we're keen to build this community of researchers. We're also open to finding ways that we can support you with kind of small resources, but also kind of, having these types of avenues to speak with people like Michael, like Raul, and other researchers to develop these ideas further. And just to say that we will have everything posted online, so please don't worry too much about recording down all the details. Great. I'd like to now pass over to Raul for some of his opening thoughts as well. Thanks, Raul.
Hello, can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you well. Yeah.
Perfect. Trying to share the slides. All right. So I think you can all see the slides, right?
Yes.
Okay, so what I want to do is just present some examples from my own research, starting very small, just by specific research questions and projects, and then take a step back and offer some perspective about what I think we have learned with regards to state fragility and what are perhaps open questions and what's the missing knowledge from my own subjective perspective. But also I want to emphasize a lot some of the peculiarities of research in so-called fragile states, because there are specific skills that junior researchers probably want to be investing in and strategies that are not true in other settings. So let me give you these examples. They all come from one place, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is in the center of this map and also has been in the center of the news last week, illustrating, I think, some of the concepts that Mike was talking about uncertainty. So the first question that I want to talk about was a study that wrestled with the notion of the state. And all of the studies I'm going to talk about have this common thread that reflects the challenges posed by a fragile state context, which is one has to think about the state very differently than in idealized Weberian state bureaucracies. And so here the motivation is in Eastern DRC, in DRC also, but especially in the eastern part, there are many places where the central state is absent, or does not seem to exercise direct control as well. That doesn't mean that the state is absent. It's present in many places. It's also present in different ways. But generally, what this means is if you think of the state as a monopoly of violence, the state does not have the monopoly of violence in many places, and many people can use violence for a variety of purposes. They can also organize violence. Sometimes they might use violence for expropriation to apply coercion, and that's kind of more commonly known perhaps as banditry. But other times they might organize violence in more sophisticated ways that start to look like state functions. And so in Eastern DRC, where you have today 122 armed organizations, at least, the latest numbers suggest more than 200, but a lot of these armed organizations develop quite sophisticated structures that start to look the way that we generally think of states. They have fiscal administrations, they have intelligence agencies, they have a division for human resources, they have customs, many of them give visas, they have formal correspondence, and most importantly, they also provide protection. And so when you talk to people who live in Eastern DRC, there seems to be two layers that coexist. On the one hand, insecurity and violence is one of the major concerns reflecting fragility. On the other hand, many of these organizations actually provide a protection that many civilians value that the state is unable to provide. Not all organizations do, and those who do don't always do it, but there is that component that's a central state function. So the question was then to try to wrestle with the notion of when do these state functions emerge? Maybe that can teach us something more generally about the process of state formation, at least from the experience of these organizations, and focusing on taxation, protection, and monopoly of violence formation by these organizations. So I want to illustrate, I don't want to focus on the methods, I want to focus on the big picture ideas, but also some part of my own intellectual trajectory that illustrates some of the challenges that you might face. As a graduate student in economics, my own conjecture was, today I see as quite naive. It was maybe there is an economic logic to the decision of these organizations to develop state functions. And naive because, yes, I found, as you will see, an answer that economic incentives play a role, but it's also a very reductionist way to interpret these organizations that was reflecting my own bias as a PhD student in economics. So the challenge here was that when there isn't a state, there are no statistics. As the etymology suggests, statistics were in fact developed by states in order to collect information on their population. So something very common to fragile state settings is there is no data. So what the study did was to create a team to reconstruct historical data collection for 250 villages, where after years of preparation, teams essentially lived 1 week in every village, talking to a variety of people in private, in public, with the elites, with the households, to try to understand when there were armed groups, when they collected taxes, when they provided protection. And it so just happens that the setting was also ideal for a research question because there were drastic shocks in commodity prices that drastically changed the incentives of armed organizations to develop state functions or not. So in certain places, the value of minerals was very high and people worked the minerals with their hands. So there was a higher value to settle and provide protection from banditry, develop taxation systems, and become the monopoly of violence. And so the answer is relatively simple. Armed groups routinely develop state functions in a variety of ways. They tend to do that more when there is an economic interest in it, in particular when a particular location can generate high revenues in taxation or in long-run expropriation. Once they settle, they find that it is in their interest to expropriate a little bit more slowly rather than take everything and tell people in advance how much they are going to expropriate, leading to the emergence of taxation, but also protection. And also what the study does is that what this process illustrates is that this can also inform bigger social science questions about the trajectories of state formation. There was an quite revealing analogy in places where it was very easy to tax the output because it was visible. Then armed groups tended to settle very quickly in the production sites, create customs, provide protection, but nothing more than that, something that resembled the kind of minimalist development of the English state when taxation could actually be largely dependent on customs in international trade around the Industrial Revolution. Whereas in places where there's a lot of economic value in transactions, but where output of the mineral was difficult to tax, the armed groups actually didn't set in the production sites. They settled in places where that income was spent, which tended to be often far away, and they developed very different type of administrations, especially fiscal and justice administrations, to kind of start taxing many other aspects of human life where such income would be reflected. So that's one example. The problem is, as I mentioned, it was a bit naive. First, it kind of ignored the implications for state building that I think is kind of the policy relevant question in this seminar today. Is like, if you have a state that has a monopoly of violence over large parts of the territory, then if you have armed groups that have incentives to provide state functions because they can tax, these state functions also provide a form of stability. They protect people. And the fact that they know that they can expropriate people for a long run in fact, disciplines their incentives to use violence against people or to pillage people. And so Here we use also a quasi-experimental shock to using a military strategy by the central government that tried to remove some armed groups from places that were taxing, but the state, because it's weak, was not able to provide protection against crime. So the consequence of that strategy was that armed groups who were providing protection were just pushed back to the forest. They were not removed, and their incentives to protect the people were dismantled. So they started pillaging the same households that they were previously protecting, having created taxation systems. We also look at a kind of another shock that another strategy that the state has used when dealing with its own weakness and the presence of many armed groups, which is bargaining with armed groups rather than military confronting them. Maybe they can share positions in the state or share rents related to the state so that the state can regain control of territory. And that, again, the weakness of the state implies that this strategy, while interesting theoretically, does not apply in a weak state as greatly. The first is by bargaining with armed groups in 2004, that generated incentives for many organizations and many people to develop armed groups. And that's why you have seen in large part the proliferation of armed groups after 2004 in the Congo, because people understood that if you create your own armed group, you can blackmail the state in order to obtain benefits. So that's one aspect. And because the state is weak, it was not able to kind of deter the formation of new armed groups. And second, by giving positions inside the state to armed groups and being a weak state, it was unable to kind of break their networks. And so that led to infiltration of the state and further weakening of the state and its legitimacy, as people understood that the state was captured in large part by foreign networks, foreign militias, in ways that have a lot to do with the conflict that you have seen in the last week in the DRC. The second thing that was quite naive was also that when you think of armed groups, they don't operate in a vacuum. There are institutions that have existed there for millennia before the fragile state that we typically focus on even existed, which is often a legacy of colonial creations. So before that, there were customary chiefs. They're still there, and the same for armed groups. So in another project, we kind of tried to take this into account, realizing that, in fact, armed groups often develop institutions of indirect rule that resemble colonial, almost British indirect rule in its colonial institutions. But over time, they transition to direct rule. And the places where they develop indirect rule, so governing through the chiefs, are places where the armed group is rather foreign and where the chief has a lot of legitimacy. So that's kind of an enrichment of this kind of simplistic or naive idea that there's just some actors that want to extract resources. There's also institutions, and the armed groups need them because they often don't have the legitimacy that these institutions have. And that has implications not only for the answering big questions about when are specific type of colonial institutions designed at the local level, but also for the governance of weak states. Because in the interior, where the state doesn't have control, there are a lot of informal institutions that, just like the state, armed groups also use because they understand the social context. And finally, another thing that was ignored in this research that required a lot of years of spending time there with the armed groups themselves is that these armed groups or stationary bandits do not come from a vacuum. They, most of them, if you look at the map that I showed you today, most of them come from community, and they come from community processes leveraged through the traditional or customary chiefs that are mobilized pre-existing institutions in order to provide security in communities, very often against the threat of Rwanda's incursion or against the violence perpetrated by some militias from Rwanda. And so once the groups form, then sure, they respond to economic incentives. And so that kind of taking a step back also helps answer big social science questions, showing that so-called conflict theories of state formation, which is what I suggested before, and demand theories of state formation, which is like people need a state, so they create the state structure, actually coexist at different steps of this process. And you can only observe that when you go to these places in fragile state that have various armed groups as well. And that's also important when you think, even from a state-centric perspective, when dealing with these armed groups, it's very different to deal with a foreign armed group than with the majority of militias in the Congo, which actually come from the communities themselves, regardless of how they later use violence. The second example I wanted to give was just a question of, if you have a weak state, what's the effect of expanding this weak state over its contract enforcement over transactions that are previously not governed by the state, but perhaps informally? So here it was like also during my own dissertation more than 10 years ago, we did a field experiment where we created a market that allows us to observe whether people pay a transaction that they have promised to pay. They buy something and we can observe whether they choose to pay. And using RCTs about institutions, so that falls in the category of studies that were presented by Michael before, we kind of randomly assign whether people are using state contracts validated by the provincial administration. And that allows us to find two things that nuances, again, the notion of a weak state and suggests that informality has a lot of advantages, suggesting expanding the weak state is not always a good idea. First, society has already institutions that govern economic transactions that compares with the state, and they often are along ethnic lines. That's not very new, but this experimental setting allows us to establish it empirically. But also, the state can actually enforce contracts, even though it's called a weak state. It's perfectly capable to enforce them, but it depends towards whom. So if someone has been defected in a contract and wants to complain in the provincial administration, if this person was a Tutsi, a Banyamulenge, everyone knew that this person had no chance of getting the contract enforced, and therefore having to sign a contract had no effect on whether someone paid in that specific case. So that also nuances the notion of state weakness by saying the state has a perfectly strong capacity to enforce contracts, but the question is that the boundaries between society and the state are more blurred than in other settings. The state is kind of used by segments of society. A third example I want to talk about also wrestles with the notion of the state. It asks about what is really the state in a so-called weak state settings. Here is kind of a problem that motivates perhaps the question in Kinshasa. This is one of the dominant roundabouts, the Rond-Point Gaba in Kinshasa, seen from the sky. Traffic jams are actually a huge problem in Kinshasa. They're a problem in every city, but especially in Kinshasa. There's a lot of chaos at the intersections. So you can think that maybe infrastructure is a problem. Maybe the state does not have enough resources to build infrastructure. That's kind of would be the development intellectual tradition. But when you think about the fragile state, it is possible that there are institutional foundations to this that relate to the state itself. So let me give you one illustration of what those might be. When you go through the streets of Kinshasa, like in many cities, you see often police officers trying to negotiate with drivers for a bribe. Often the conversations become quite violent, and the police officers then often take the radio, take the key, or take a wheel to immobilize the vehicle and then bring the vehicle to the police station where a negotiation takes place. And so the question that we wanted to answer in this study is how is corruption organized, because something has to do with the police stations here, and whether that matters for this kind of public goods problems and how that matters that I illustrated, like traffic jams and chaos in the street. So this was a study in Kinshasa in 2015 that required years of relationships with anthropologists and insiders in the corruption scheme of the traffic police, and spent a lot of time trying to convince commanders to agree to experimentally vary certain aspects of the corruption scheme, while also being mindful of not pressuring commanders, and also developing a variety of data collection systems that would not interfere with the incentives of the different participants, involving 160 observers from many different institutions. But the point is, the findings is, there's a scheme called the quota system where traffic police officers have to bring vehicles to the police station for their commander to take a bribe. It reflects a coalition of commanders, traffic police agents, and judicial police. That scheme generates 5 times more income than that which is visible in official statistics. And that income is based on extorting drivers, by which I mean there's a distinction between just bribery and extortion. It means that it doesn't matter whether the driver had respected the law. They were able to fabricate allegations. And what really mattered is whether the driver had powerful connections inside the state administration. What the experiment allowed us to find also, here's another example of experiment about institutions, is that this scheme, where the commander asks police officers to bring a given number of cars to the police station every day, is costly for public service. It causes traffic jams, accidents, and it undermines the ability of the agency to enforce the law. Partly because officers spend a lot of time through these harassment interactions that I've shown you that are targeting drivers that have not necessarily violated the law, but are particularly weak. They don't have powerful friends. The implication is that the really existing state actually has a lot more capacity than you might think, even though the Congolese state is portrayed as weak. Its capacity to generate income using the organizational structure of the state is much larger. And that revenue funds officials' income. It's their wages. They're essentially not paid or very underpaid. It finances also operating costs like gas expenses, but also the scheme undermines some service. So you can see how that nuances again the notion of weak state. It's actually a strong state, but the way it operates kind of as a second best is also costly for society. And the last example I wanted to give is a study where after 15 years working in Eastern DRC, we ended up working with one of the major militias of the Congo in order to answer a question that's missing in, at least in economics of conflict, that tends to focus on economic incentives. Like there is conflict because people want revenues from mineral. It's kind of the dominant narrative in the news, but also in academic research in economics. So we wanted to understand whether social orientations or social motivations were important to understand who volunteers to join those militias, just like who volunteers to join national armies. Imagine the United States, for example. So what the study does is works with this major armed group in the DRC and embeds a real-time monitoring system inside its HR division that has 55 human resource commanders giving us daily information of who joins. And that's based on a 10-year-long personal friendship with some people of the group. The answer is that joiners are actually more pro-social than the rest. They are not psychopaths. They're actually more socially oriented, and they value much more contributing to the collective. The collective is an area as large as Switzerland. Joiners also suppress their empathy to their enemy more than other people. They're much more inclined to hurt the enemy, even though they are the most pro-social types. And that operates in an environment with a morality of war among civilians that justifies joining the group because of the consequences of joining for the defense of territorial integrity, but also justifies killing the enemy. Killing the enemy is seen by civilians as a moral duty, in large part because of retaliation of 30 years of massacres by the enemy, violent dispossessions of their historical homeland, and also partly because of violence is seen as a necessity for liberation from oppression from that enemy. In some cases, we also find evidence that this morality has, because it's been 30 years, has kind of easily turned into genocidal morality, where the boundaries between enemy combatants and enemy civilians is blurred. And so that kind of illustrates some of the aspects that are typically unseen in this context. Just as an illustration, so that personal relationships give a lot of access in this type of settings when they're genuine. So here's, for example, the administrative records of a major armed group in the Congo that illustrate their revenue since 2017. I only show this for illustration to show the kind of access that personal relations can afford in a setting where personal relations are actually the only vehicle through which society is organized. And so here is the example of the centrality of personal relations. Lewis, who presented his autobiography as a former war victim, but also child soldier at the University of Chicago, is with whom we have built a 10-year-long relationship that kind of enabled access to a variety of groups. Here is Lewis with some of the militia leaders. So just takeaways from all that. First, what have we learned? I think intellectually better to think of state functions than of states. When people use the word state, it actually reflects a legalistic approach from the international state system. When you think of a fragile state, many different actors are providing state functions. Some of them are called by other states or other coercive organizations. They're called a state, but it doesn't matter who calls them a state. What matters is that they perform state functions, and that's important for policy. That's important for understanding violence as well. Second, the formal state can undermine the stability that exists in informal state functions because it interacts with other actors that also provide state functions. And three, overall, it kind of nuances the notion of a weak state. It's not that it can't do things, but it doesn't want to because the boundaries between the state and society are blurred. And it's actually not weak. It's just that you, often researchers from the outside, using official statistics, cannot see how it works. And there's a large literature in anthropology called real governance that focuses on this. I'll skip this slide, but all I want to say is that in general, I don't know if you have noticed, for every single question that has policy relevance, the third bullet point kind of illustrates that there is a potential for social science and economics in fragile states to generate questions and answers that are very difficult otherwise to observe, but that contribute to kind of the general experience of humanity and of political economy or of development more generally. All of the notions that I've spoken about, they are present in so-called strong states. They may be present in different proportions, but historically they have been present everywhere. The second takeaway is regarding the type of questions as you go into research. I think the most obvious instinct of development scholars is to ask questions like, can we give some bed nets and then see what happens? These questions are very important in the specific time and setting in which they are formulated, so that if there was a technocrat that was interested in changing some outcomes, then they would want to know that. But in reality, society is political, and the decisions that politicians or technocrats have reflect a variety of interests. And so that's first. And the second, often questions that are like impact evaluations about policies tend to have little generalizability even in the same society in the future. So I think I would like to encourage you to also answer a second type of question that can be done in the same type of study, which is understanding fundamentals of human collective behavior that are specific, especially in the context of fragile states, and thinking about how your research can be useful for the populations of fragile states, but also for the development of social science. And third, there is also another branch of research, especially in fragile states, that focuses on some other type of impact evaluation, which is understanding the causes and effects of drastic historical events that shaped the trajectory of humanity. So the effects of the slave trade on Africa today, the effects of colonization, or the effects of different types of institutions. Even though they might not teach us a lot about fundamentals of human behavior, they're also crucial and specifically applied to fragile states, which have a lot of also legacies from extreme events. These can be done mostly, I think, a big component, I don't know if you realized in the examples I gave you, the descriptive component is central, because we don't know anything about how society organizes itself in a fragile state. Only the participants do, and the participants are rarely the researchers themselves. Two, quasi-experimental studies offer a big avenue to examine critical junctures in real time, and something that Mike has spoken about and given examples. And lastly, there is a huge scope to do experiments about institutions, even at the micro level. For example, if you look at the experiment in contracting that I presented at the beginning, this was extremely simple to organize after understanding the context. And it only cost a few $1,000s. It took very little time. So you can go at a very micro level to understand very important features of institutions. I think there's a huge reward in that. Now, the third and last takeaway is the how-to, that's specific, how I started the presentation, to research in fragile states. First, you have to think carefully about creating measurement capacity where often there isn't. So there's a huge reward, not just to create organizations, but to think very creatively on measurements. Think of the study on the police that I talked about. I skipped the measurements, but that was the heavy lifting of the study, was to creatively think measurements that would not influence the incentives of the participants. And it required many, many different strategies, a lot of conversations with people in the community. When you create data collection capacity, that doesn't mean that there is no capacity. There's a huge amount of capacity. It's just not geared towards the kind of objectives that researchers often in the West have. So the creation of data collection capacity is done jointly, and people bring skills from two different sides of the equation. Two, as you may have noticed, that's specific to fragile state settings when most societies organize informally, not through formal contracts or not through the bureaucracy. Personal friendships and relationships are crucial, especially if those are genuine, both for the efficiency of data collection. They are crucial to induce motivation of data collectors, but they are also crucial to develop questions in the first place. So fragile states of all places are a place where local participants and local researchers should be given a central stage, not just as co-authors, but actually in the development of the questions and also articulation of the problems. I skipped an important part, but it's central to the fragile states. There are unusual ethical and legal risks for which IRB is completely maladapted. So a lot of the research that I've showed you required working a lot with legal counsel at various universities and developing local organizations that feel empowered to provide advice over what to do and what not to do. Generally, there is an aspect of positionality in this type of research. So who are the fragile states? Typically, they are states that have been under different phases of European imperialism, and there are relationships of powers that persist. Who are the researchers? Typically, they are from the US or Europe. And who is the audience of the researchers? Typically, they are from the research or Europe. So that what generates is incentives to generate poor research by researchers who don't understand the context, who exercise power relations to induce essentially data collectors to generate the outcomes that they want, not the data per se, but to kind of create self-fulfilling cycles where the priors of the researchers seem to be validated by the results, even though they might not be the correct interpretation. And so that's more than critiquing, is an encouragement for everyone to think carefully about those issues, not just because of the ethics of it, but the quality of the research. And so thinking carefully about who is the we when questions are asked, and who is we talking to, and what for. So I think I've spoken too much. I had kind of a psychoanalysis of our own worldview when we were graduate students, with the centrality of Europeans as kind of missing the role of Congolese in their own worldview, but I'll skip it. The point is, research on fragile states is at its infancy, it's growing. It is precisely why this anthropological side is crucial, because most of it is informal and most of it is unknown. And reflecting on relationships of power is important. And to finish, qualitative work is crucial, especially because most of it is unknown to the outside researcher. I think that kind of shifts the type of social science that we do towards a more subjectivist social science. While in physics, you cannot talk to apples, in social science, you have many ways to acquire information from humans, body language, probes, spending time together. There's a technology that exists, it's called empathy. And even though we don't write papers based on qualitative information, that's a central aspect of the skills that you have to be thinking about in developing when working in fragile states, and that really are one of the central inputs into the quality of the research. So with that, I'll stop. I think I've talked a bit too much.
Great. Thank you very much, Roland. A lot of really interesting ideas and great examples of some of the work that you've done. So I hope that's inspired a lot of us in terms of possible avenues for research. I'd like to now quickly hand over to the IGC team. So Abdi Ali, who's our head of the State Fragility Initiative at IGC, he will go into more detail on his team on the exact kind of opportunity we have here for researchers. He'll describe a little bit about the initiative itself, but also then go into the funding opportunities. And I think that will address many of the questions that have been in the chat. And just to say, we will take questions afterwards, and we'll try to do our best to answer as many as possible. So over to you, Abdi. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Raul and Mike. So just to introduce myself, my name is Abdi Ali. I'm the head of the State Fragility Initiative at the IGC. And I promise I will not take more than 5 minutes, because I want you to digest the really interesting presentation by Raul and Mike. So just to say that the State Fragility Initiative has been actually around since 2019, and it actually builds on and tries to take into practice the recommendations of the LSE Oxford Commission on State Fragility. Basically, that commission, you may know, was chaired by David Cameron, the former Prime Minister of the UK, along with Donald Kembaruka, who was the president of the African Development Bank, among other, So basically, there were really eminent people within that commission, including Professor Paul Collier, Tim Beasley, and Adnan Khan, and others. And what we are trying to do is, since 2019, is to work with researchers to improve basically analytical work, basically commission some of the work that Mike and Raul were talking about among others, to make sure that we have basically research that informs policy and touches upon most of the things that that was covered by Raul and Mike. So basically, our work is at two levels. At the country level, we do what's called country engagement level, and there we've done a lot of work. We've worked in Sudan, in Yemen, Solomon Islands, many other places. And at the moment, since 2020, we've been working with the internationally recognized government of Yemen, trying to support the government with policy advice to make sure that it kind of alleviates some of the problems that exists in that country and make sure that the country emerges from fragility. But we've done a lot of other kind of global engagements. A lot of work we have done has to do with energy access in fragile contexts, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And that is work that I will really invite you to have a look at on our website. But also since 2019, we have been doing the DFI Fragility Forum, which is this really high-level forum that development finance institutions attend. It's held annually at the Blavatsky School of Government at the University of Oxford. And it tries to kind of galvanize private investments in these really hard places that Raul and Mike talked about, places that are really not easy for private investments. Now, in terms of the initiative itself, the initiative actually touches all the things that have been mentioned. Essentially, the first kind of strategy, the strategic pillar, is this work stream that we call Getting the Politics Right, but it actually talks about most of the things that Mike and Raul talked about. It's about basically it's strengthening institutions and so on and so on, and then private investment led by Amna Mahmoud, and this is about how do you actually create jobs and opportunities without private investment, given the challenges that exist in those places, very difficult. And then our basically largest work stream is on energy, climate change, displacement, refugees, and things like that. And it's led by my colleagues there. So basically, just to give you just an overview of what the things we're interested in, but of course there are many other topics that the State Fragility is interested in, and the ideas that Raul and Mike mentioned, these are really important because they touch the essence of the problem that exists. Basically, the idea that fragility is on the rise. So what can we do to kind of find viable solutions? And research is basically the entry point. In terms of the grant, so the idea basically is to incentivize more and create a community of researchers, particularly younger researchers, interested in these tough questions that were mentioned before. And the idea is to support them to do some preliminary stuff, field visits perhaps, to kind of incentivize more people to do research in this space. This space is under-researched, as Mike was showing the data on. So the examples of some of the things we could support are there. But the only thing I want to emphasize here is that the deadline is relatively, time is not on our hand. So please do, if you have any ideas, do try to submit your proposal. And then, of course, it will be competitively reviewed by the SFI team. And basically, how to apply, there will be an email that follows. And that email would basically detail, and then there is a link that already Greg has put on the chat. And please click on those links, and there you will find the application form, some further guidance around what are the specific things we're looking for. But more importantly, we want you to engage with the team, with the SFI team, so that we can kind of try to support you if you have any questions. Mike is the academic lead. And if you have really tough questions, we can pass it on to Raul and Mike and Tim. But most of the logistical questions we'll be able to take care. But we will share this. Everything will be shared with you. But the idea anyway is that we need to engage with you and have these conversations again and again. The idea is we want, as Mike was saying, fragility to be something that many more young researchers in particular are interested in because there are potential basically gains to be had. The potential is huge here. So I'm going to stop it there. Over to you, Tim.
Great. Thank you, Abdi. So I'll just reiterate that all these resources are available online, and we'll send a follow-up email that lays out the possible steps for those that are interested in funding. So what I will do is I will formally close the webinar now, but we will stay on to answer any questions that are in the chat, as well as that you may have based on the conversations that we've had so far. So kind of without that, before we go into that, sorry, let me just say thank you to Michael, Raul, and Abdi and his team for joining. And I think if for those that need to, please feel free to drop off, but we'll go through now piece by piece some of the questions in the chat, and I'll try to be as brief as possible. So the first question kind of relating to scoping grants for funding ongoing research. So we're initially thinking about using these as starter grants. So if you're keen to test out an idea or keen to get to understand in context more, then you should apply. If you're interested to extend existing or ongoing research, I would suggest you reach out to us separately and we could perhaps have a conversation around that. But this is really designed to be scoping. So I will pitch a question to Michael and Raul. So there's a question from Andrew about innovative ideas for measuring exposure to violence or conflict, other than using kind of some previously kind of collected conflict data from like ACLED, etc. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on kind of ways to think about measuring violence or conflict that could be worth pointing to.
So I have some thoughts. I'm sure Raul does as well. So these are just other strategies I've seen be successful. So a lot of the sort of international publicly available data sets on conflict are often sort of rooted in media reports or aggregating media reports. It's also often the business of the administrative entities involved in that violence to track it. So, Afghanistan, for example, has some of the richest violence data in the world just because NATO tracked it with extreme detail. I've known people, for example, who've reconstructed comprehensive data sets on the history of violence in the Philippines, working with the Philippine Army. So one very successful strategy is it takes work and takes relationship building, but is to work with the administrative bodies that are otherwise have their own internal administrative reason to be tracking these incidents. So that's kind of another resource. I'm sure Raul is, it really is the authority on this, so I'll defer, but that's one thought.
I can think of some ideas. The first that raises some challenges that are being discussed more than 10 years ago is the collection of retrospective self-reported information about exposure to violent events. That also was part of the first study that I suggested, but it's actually a very sensitive question because violence, depending on the type of violence, there are questions of trauma and re-traumatizing, and also the same kind of power relations can imply that often researchers might not even be aware that they are re-traumatizing. But there's a lot of discussion about how to do it, and so that's one way, depending on the type of violence events that one is interested in. That can be at the individual level, that can be at the village level, where perhaps questions of trauma could be partly mitigated. What kind of violent events the village or the community has received can be conquest attempts, can be attacks against civilians of various types. Another approach that I've seen used in the DRC and that I have used then myself also is to create real-time notification system using cell phones. So one of the early studies that I've seen was called Voix de Kivu, which is in Journal of Conflict Resolution. Sets up a crowd-sitting approach where people are trained to use a phone and report information. A very long list of events, including violent events from many different villages. It was kind of a pilot. So then with other collaborators. We did that in about 100 villages in North Kivu, and it gives like very, very rich information on what's happening in the village. That's of course costly, but that's why there are funds for this. The second, for those who are interested in the DRC specifically, the Kivu Security Tracker is kind of the authority of Eastern DRC. I think until recently, they have made their data a bit less available because they realized that there was a scandal 2 years ago. Their data could be scraped and identifiable information was made public. But that's the best data that I know in that part of the world. And the other is INSO, which is International NGOs, I think security organization. They give real-time alerts. You're not allowed to share them. It's typically shared with local NGOs, but they can be used potentially with some rights to conduct analysis. So that's, I think, what I've seen. And also talking to the armed actors themselves, I came to examine the validity of the ACLED data locally. And it turns out that, as you might expect, ACLED misses a huge amount of events that the actors themselves actually say that they perpetrated, but are not in the ACLED. Often ACLED mislocates events because they are villages with similar names. Often they locate it in central capitals. And so that kind of creates special patterns that are not related to true violence, but just to measurement error. I think ACLED has improved over the last 10 years, but these are issues to take into account. Yeah.
Wonderful. So that's great. So I've been going through the chat as well, answering a few points. Just on, so criteria for the fund, we had a number of questions on this. I think, so, okay, what makes an early career researcher? I think we're quite agnostic, flexible, so we would want you to be either a PhD student, a postdoc, or kind of a pretty early stage junior professor. So the idea is to try to skew the resources towards those that are just kind of starting up kind of their hopefully illustrious future research career. In terms of criteria for the fund, obviously there's the topical relevance. Does it fit with some of the questions that Michael and Raul have been, or kind of the topics that they've been discussing? Beyond that, I think it's really trying to get a sense of whether the ideas that you're trying to develop seem promising. So it's not about whether you have a perfect proposal. It's not about whether you have perfect identification. It's about, are you asking what we think are interesting and important questions? And do we think we can support you in the process of developing those ideas further? So even if it doesn't translate to a project, that's still totally fine. So we're really quite flexible and open. We're really just trying to get the best sense of what are some of the ideas that you have, and do you have like a reasonable first way to try to think about developing those ideas into a research question that can be answered. We've had a couple of points on environment and climate change and that nexus with fragility. So that is certainly something that is also interesting and important. So we would encourage that type of work. We've had another couple of questions about those who are perhaps even earlier stage. So those before the PhD, about kind of pre-docs or MSc students. So to be very honest, I think it might be tricky. I'm not going to close the door on you, but I think we are imagining that this is best suited for someone who has a couple of years ahead of them to really pursue a potential project out of this. So I think please do kind of stay involved and in touch with us if you're an MSc student or someone who's kind of at the pre-doc stage. But we would definitely... So yeah, we would like to kind of see your ideas as well, but I think it might be something that might not be well suited. But I would suggest if you're kind of unsure, please do still talk to our team, and we can perhaps see what might be doable. Okay, I mean, so there's a couple of more substantive questions. I think... Oh, sorry, just to answer another one as I see it. So geographic restrictions, we don't have any restrictions. So I think of course, if it aligns with an IGC country, that's nice and beneficial. But even some of the examples that we've discussed today are not in the IGC realm. And I think what matters is if the context is important, and allows you to explore some of these topics of fragility. And in that sense, we're quite open to where that actually takes place. And in terms of the nature of the methodology, like a more macro study, what are the chances of that being supported? I think, again, I won't close the door here. I think we'd want to think quite carefully about what are you going to be able to answer in a meaningful way that allows us to better understand some of these issues and dynamics. And so maybe you're quite interested in gathering data from kind of new types of data from a wide set of countries, and that is what is going to help you kind of think about some cross-country or kind of wider trends and relationships that might help us think about some of these questions. So in that case, that could be possibly something to look at as well. But I think in general, we will try to emphasize arriving at a answerable, like a research question that can be kind of tested and answered in different ways. And that often does involve some kind of more detailed data and kind of other approaches. But again, at this early stage, it's really about uncovering what this research question, research project might look like. So it's totally fine at this stage to say, I want to do a bit more qualitative or spend some time in these contexts, do more anthropological type work to get a better sense of what a future initiative or intervention might look like in this space. And that would be totally valuable. Okay, so at risk of making this unstructured, Michael, Raul, I mean, I think you can see some of the comments in the Q&A. I don't know if you'd like to pick some of the more substantive ones on kind of some of the research designs, etc. I can try to summarize them, but they are quite lengthy, and we can also take this offline. But
I can see them. I'm happy to try a few. I think we'll probably have way more than we can get to. So apologies in advance if your question doesn't get answered. We're doing this really rather at random. So one question is just about sort of the lessons we've learned about kind of doing research in these settings. I think Raul already talked quite a bit about that. I think his point on sort of really having sort of deep contextual connections is quite important. That is kind of the root of everything. You can never expect, for example, your university's IRB to understand as much about what the real risks in the setting are as people who live there and work there and have those concerns as sort of a day-to-day experience. So I think that's one sort of unavoidable part of this, is you really do have to sort of immerse yourself in the context and kind of, I guess, really get to know it well and be incredibly sensitive to the risks that it implies. I think the flip side of that is that you learn a lot about the world that you wouldn't otherwise. And so I think Raul's point that there's sort of deep points about how institutions, sort of informal institutions, work really kind of comes in large part from the anthropological work. I agree with completely. So I don't know if that completely answers. I mean, we could run a whole seminar on what we've learned about how to do this practically. That's probably beyond what we can answer right now, but hopefully that's at least a start.
I'm still scrolling through the comments. Yeah. There was a specific question on the role of religiosity by Aya in the question on the study on moral violence. I think it's very central to that. In the specific context in which I study, religiosity plays no role, at least monotheistic religions. Religious beliefs that are not of a monotheistic nature play a role in the context that I study, but mostly play two functions. The first is to motivate the combatants. So they have the beliefs in the ancestors that are invoked to kind of give them luck in combat or provide protection. And that kind of, we have seen through other studies that actually is a very powerful way for organizations to become more effective. They leverage the existing cultural beliefs to solve the major problem of military organizations, which is fighters are afraid to die. So there's a huge moral hazard problem. So that's where religion plays a role. It also plays a role in a second aspect, that by invoking ancestors regularly, there's kind of a dichotomy between Christianity or monotheistic religions and the religions about ancestors that kind of creates a boundary between militias and the rest of society. They become almost like they cannot touch civilians. They are on this side that some people ascribe to, kind of the darker side that you can manipulate forces. And so that kind of has a function of create group identity and group belonging. That's important for cohesion. That side plays a role. In DRC, monotheistic religions only play some role, perhaps in the IDF Nalu on the Grand Nord, in the northern part of North Kivu, that has raised interest of the United States because they recently were seen with the flag of ISIS, but actually it's not even, it's secondary to what the group does. I think a lot of it is just framing by outsiders. Yeah, I'll continue.
Great, and I think I'll just volunteer, Michael and Russell, if you have a substantive question. I mean, some of these are quite rich questions, so I think feel free to reach out to them after this webinar. So it might not be the best modality right now to try to answer all of these in the depth that you're asking, but great to see all of this interest. So I think, yeah, there's actually, so one person's asking, so IGC has annual call for proposals, and we've just finished the last one at the end of last year. So some of you may have been successful, some of you may have been unsuccessful. So if you've been unsuccessful, it is absolutely fine to still consider applying for this. And in fact, it might even be like the better option, because I think often for the global call for proposals, we're typically evaluating pretty developed and advanced projects. And this funding round is really designed to kind of help build up projects to get to that stage. So you might imagine that you start off with this small scoping grant, and then next year you apply for an IGC proposal. But just to say, please feel free to use a similar idea or even the same idea if it wasn't successful in an IGC proposal round previously. It might still just be a better fit now. So don't feel shy to try to use a similar proposal. I mean, I think this is more of a methodological conceptual question from Emma at UCL. I mean, there's a particular setting which they're focusing on, kind of peace and sustainability in the Middle East, in particular interactions between Palestinians and Israelis. But I think the core of the question is, how should we think about surveys or interviews where respondents may be hesitant to participate, or where you think that the responses might be heavily influenced by ongoing violence? So how do we kind of think about situations like this, and is there any kind of high-level advice you might give?
So one, it sounds like a fascinating study, so great idea. Certainly the question caught my eye. One thing that I've found quite useful, so for example, working currently on sort of women's education in Afghanistan, which is a super sensitive topic. And my approach to it is to just make sure that I kind of vet every single thing that I would consider asking any of my participants in my study through people who have sort of relevant domain knowledge in the field, and kind of give them effectively complete veto rights over sort of any direction of the study that they know is just going to be too sensitive or bothersome for the respondents. And so I mean, it kind of short answer is I would try to find a local partner that you feel like really understands things, maybe even just kind of developing really close relationships with a set of the students themselves, and get their perspective on what's appropriate and inappropriate. I think that's rather separate from the question of, like, would you expect there to be some sort of survey response bias related to the kind of the ongoing politics of the region? That's kind of a different thing that requires a different form of creativity, but it's also, I think, an important consideration. So you're right to be thinking about it. Often there's not an easy answer to that challenge, but I think that's part of what makes good research, is sort of figuring out, can you really observe the behavior that you care about, that in a way that would convince your readers and your viewers. So I think just sort of thinking about it a lot and spending time with people who understand the context is going to be the best solution. Sounds like you're already doing that, but that's my approach, is I just make sure people can tell me, no, this isn't something you ought to be asking about.
I completely second that. That's especially for people who come from the outside, having a person that is in the community, that is an implementing partner, is kind of the only way to go. In the example of the police study, for example, it was someone from inside the community as well as an anthropologist who had spent 10 years there. I think we cannot expect to be able to answer these questions by ourselves when it's not our own place. I think in terms of the validity of the research question, conflict is a bundle that social scientists, especially economists, don't really understand. Many conflicts look different. Many phases of conflict look different. And so whether the particular phase of the quote-unquote conflict now is different, I think is not so important from the perspective of you as a researcher as much as what you can find about it. So I'm going to give you one example of a study that uses changes in the face of a conflict in Kenya. I think this is a study in the QJE by Jonas Hirt that looks at the relationships between different ethnic groups in Kenya. And it just so happens that in the middle of his data collection, there was a spike in tensions between the two groups. And that allowed him to kind of show how the very same finding that he had at baseline just accentuates when the context changes. So that can be an opportunity to either show changes but it's not a challenge, I think, from external validity, given how little we know about it.
Great. So I think there's another, so someone's asked about kind of kind of refugee issues, kind of country, like cross-country spillovers, if you will, from kind of conflict or instability to one country and how that affects another country. I think that's certainly a leading area of interest for us. We have quite a bit of work historically, for instance, on refugee integration in Jordan. And so I think that's been kind of an interesting space of work. So definitely we'd encourage work in that space as well. And on the kind of duration of these grants, I think we would look to, these would, by virtue of them being quite small, these would generally be quite short term. So, 6 months, it can be a year depending on the nature of your work, but it would definitely not be longer than 1 year. Okay, so I'm mindful of time. So I think there's a few kind of broader, bigger points on like, under what conditions do elites or those in power or the government is maybe the same, maybe not the same. Under what conditions do they have incentives for formality versus kind of keeping in this kind of gray zone where there's informality or kind of unclear states? I think that's, I think it's a very interesting question. I think it's worth, I definitely would not say we have an answer on that one, but I'll let the experts come in. So that's, but that would be a kind of a very overarching kind of interesting question we'd love to explore. And I think there was a related point kind of thinking about armed groups and how they themselves might emerge as kind of groups that defend against other groups, etc. But there's also a risk that if, an armed group might provide initially protection services, but then at some point could also become expansionary and more offensive. So kind of, I think, so again, that's kind of a point on like, studying the nature of armed groups and the evolution of, how these armed groups interact and dynamically evolve, I think. I'll let Michael and Raul come in on any of those 2 points, but I seem like both of those are very interesting topics and definitely right up the alley for us. But, yeah.
So I think it's an opportunity to just kind of point out what are the types of things that we'd be really excited to see. And I think they kind of fall into 2 big buckets. I think one are exactly these questions, which are sort of, what are the dynamics of a fragile state? What are the ways that we ought to conceptualize fragility? Why is it special? And what does that mean for the development of sort of formal and informal institutions and economic progress and development? That's one category. The other category is just like, given the necessity of sort of meeting the sustainable development goals in these settings, what are effective policies that can work despite the challenges that are sort of inherent in working in a fragile state? And so, that I would be very interested in seeing proposals linked to both, sort of what are actionable policy solutions that really can work even in the most challenging places, and what are the things that we need to be thinking about conceptually when we're thinking about these places. So that's kind of a non-answer, but hopefully that'll give you some framing as you think about what we'd like to support.
I have two questions. One is about whether the question of endogenous incentives of officials to use informality or formality. That's of course a very important question. That's not the question that the study answered, to the extent that states tend to expand. So one can learn about the effects on society, taking into account the role of society in the absence of the state. But also there is another aspect of the motivation is that there's a broad consensus in the development community towards formalization. And that kind of is a note of caution that even if such push existed, regardless of the incentives, then there are these things to take into account. I think there's a broader literature with regards to the corruption, whether officials and civilians choose to collude against formality or enforcement of the law, or rather whether officials kind of use formality as a threat in order to extract rents, are things that are fundamental. And perhaps more fundamental, there is a literature in political economy about endogenous state capacity, endogenous institutions as a result of incentives of people in power. I think the current situation in the Congo is a good example of that. Since Mobutu, and especially since the killing of Kabila father in 2001, the leaders in the Congo have understood that one of the biggest threats for them was a functioning military, because they could do a coup. And so they have intentionally, this is not just a failure or a flaw or a miscalculation, undermined the military. They have underfunded it, and they have encouraged soldiers to derive income from the power that they have over civilians. So that is also why it's very easy for neighboring countries to take over the country, because of the weakness and therefore corruption in the Congolese army. To maintain their power, however, they have invested in a different type of state capacity, elite units that provide protection to the president, that are loyal to the president. So in that sense, the Congo has a lot of formal capacity, but it's directed for the protection of the interests of an elite. You have mercenary groups where often use the Republican Guard is also one example. I thought the connection could be relevant. I missed the question on the armed groups that first defend and then are expansionary. I'm happy to say a few words on it. It's actually very spot on. One of the studies that I briefly alluded to studies the spectacular rise of a militia in the Congo called the Raia Mutomboki, which means the outraged citizens. It was probably the most successful violent social movement in the history of the DRC since independence. They were completely successful at eradicating from their district a very violent external actor called the FDLR, which are former genocidarian militias from Rwanda that have been operating in Congo. But as the group grows, so there's a hugely important communal logic that many qualitative researchers called social movement. But as they grow, they started splitting into smaller, more independent units, and economic incentives become more and more important rather than just funding their operations. They became often just the very basis of what they were there for, to tax mineral trade and so on. So I think it's an important thing to nuance, acknowledging the different layers, they can coexist at different phases. I don't know if that answers the question, because I missed it. But...
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. I think we'll have to end the webinar. It's been, I think, I did not expect this many questions. I'm really glad to see this level of engagement and interest. And so thank you again for participating. Just to underline that we will share all the materials. Please check the IGC website. And you'll see all the next steps and processes for potentially applying for funding. But we look forward to hearing from you, and we can virtually all in our kind of own Zoom rooms clap and thank for Michael and Raul for their time and their ideas. So thank you, everybody, and thank you also to the SFI team and VoxDev for helping organize this webinar. So thank you. Bye.
Everyone. Bye.